I froze in my tracks as I overheard Matthew's chilling words to his father. He was asking Carl if it wasn't time to get rid of that woman, meaning me. Carl's response sent shivers down my spine. He agreed, but said I still had some use until the inheritance came through. I hadn't realized Carl was awake, as we sleep in separate bedrooms. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their unsettling conversation rooted me to the spot. For the next half year, I pretended I hadn't heard anything, maintaining my usual demeanor. On the morning of Matthew's college graduation, he bustled about, preparing to leave. There was no word of thanks for raising him, no invitation to join them for a meal. Matthew's only words to me were that he wouldn't need dinner. If I hadn't overheard that conversation, it might not have bothered me, but now it stung. I knew they were probably going out to eat with Matthew's birth mother. Carl also said he wouldn't need a meal. As the house fell silent after they left, I sat alone with pen and paper. My name is Susan, and I'm 55 years old. I've been living with my husband Carl and his son Matthew for 20 years. Carl and I are both in our second marriages. My first marriage ended badly, leaving me emotionally scarred and discarded by my ex-husband's family. Carl, an old high school classmate, reached out to me during this dark time. We reconnected at a small reunion, exchanging contact information after he learned of my divorce. Carl was a single father to 2-year-old Matthew at the time. His words of encouragement about moving forward with our lives were a lifeline to me. We quickly bonded over our shared emotional wounds and fell in love. Despite my fear of remarrying, Carl's persistence won me over, and we tied the knot when I was 35. After marriage, I quit my job to become a full-time housewife and stepmother. Many advised against this decision, but I believed it was crucial to bond with young Matthew. I loved children and wanted to give my all to raising him. However, I soon realized how naive my expectations had been. Matthew was a difficult child. He wouldn't eat or sleep, and he'd cry at the mere sight of me. I tried everything to win him over, enduring sleepless nights and exhausting days. Carl's comment about Matthew not being used to my face because his ex-wife was pretty cut deep. He continued to compare me unfavorably to his ex-wife, criticizing my cooking and parenting skills. The supportive man I'd married seemed to have transformed into someone who treated me like a servant. Despite my best efforts, Matthew never warmed up to me, and Carl's behavior only worsened. I found myself contemplating divorce just 1 year into our marriage, a thought that haunted me more often than I care to admit. However, I knew that ending things so soon would only invite ridicule from those who doubted our union from the start. I clung to the old saying, 3 years on a stone, desperately encouraging myself to persevere through the challenges. Despite my best efforts, Matthew never truly warmed up to me. Although he no longer cried at the sight of my face, he never smiled at me or called me Mom. It puzzled and hurt me to see him shower affection on Carl, Carl's family, and even strangers while seeming to dislike me intensely. Yet, I couldn't help but develop a growing love for Matthew as I watched him grow. His milestones filled me with joy, even as our relationship remained strained. When Matthew started preschool, he finally began calling me Mom, but it was a hollow victory. At his first parent observation day, Matthew furiously sent me away, his face contorted with anger. The teachers dismissed my concerns, claiming it was just a phase of attachment. I found myself constantly torn between pride in his growth and anguish over our fractured relationship. Carl offered no support, dismissively telling me Matthew would get used to me eventually. One day, I decided to confront Matthew directly about our relationship. I told him I loved him and asked what I could do to make him like me. His response shocked me to my core. Matthew asked if I really liked him, disbelief evident in his voice. When I assured him I did, he accused me of lying, saying Carl had told him I disliked him. I was stunned, unable to comprehend why Carl would say such a thing. Matthew went on to call me a fake mother, blaming me for his birth mother's absence. That night, I confronted Carl about what Matthew had said. To my dismay, Carl admitted to telling Matthew these things, justifying it by saying it wasn't untrue since Matthew didn't like me. I was too hurt and angry to respond, unable to understand Carl's motives. As time passed, the rift between Matthew and me only grew, and I felt my connection to Carl slipping away as well. Yet, life moved forward relentlessly, and soon we were preparing for Matthew's first day of elementary school. Carl casually pointed out an expensive backpack, suggesting we ask my parents to buy it as a gift. I was taken aback by both the price and Carl's assumption about my family's willingness to pay. It was true that my family was well off, with real estate holdings and my grandfather once making the list of wealthy individuals. I shouldn't have been surprised that Carl knew about my family's wealth, given we attended the same high school. It's not uncommon for grandparents to buy school bags for their grandchildren's first day of school. However, Matthew isn't related to my parents by blood, and he doesn't even like me. I've never taken him to visit my family, not even for Christmas. Carl always refused, saying he and Matthew had no blood connection to my parents. Yet now he expected them to buy an expensive school bag? I gently refused Carl's suggestion, but he became irritated. He insisted I should at least ask, saying if my parents refused, he'd know where things stood. His condescending tone angered me, but I bit my tongue. I secretly planned to use my own savings to buy the bag and pretend it was from my parents. To my surprise, my mother called, offering to buy Matthew's school bag herself. She said it was natural for grandparents to do so. Her words, acknowledging me as Matthew's mother, brought tears to my eyes. When the plain black school bag arrived, Matthew was initially excited. Carl, however, frowned and complained it wasn't luxurious enough. His criticism quickly dampened Matthew's enthusiasm. Similar incidents occurred when Matthew entered middle school, with Carl demanding expensive brand-name items from my parents. By this time, Matthew had started mocking me of his own accord, no longer just following Carl's lead. He'd make snide comments about how lucky I was to marry his father just because my family was rich. I realized Carl had married me for my family's money and to have someone to take care of Matthew. I'd given up on Matthew ever liking me, but I still saw raising him as my duty. I feared divorcing Carl would make Matthew's life harder. Even if I wasn't the mother he wanted, my love for him was genuine. When Matthew graduated high school and entered college, Carl demanded my parents' help with the expensive tuition fees. He argued that the money would eventually be mine anyway. His callous words stung, but I knew I couldn't ask my parents for such a large sum. To avoid Carl's inevitable criticism, I secretly used the alimony from my previous divorce to cover Matthew's tuition. It meant sacrificing plans I had for myself, but I convinced myself it was worth it for Matthew's future. As Matthew neared graduation with a job offer in hand, I felt a bittersweet sense of accomplishment. One night, I woke up and noticed a light in the kitchen. Assuming Matthew had returned from a night out, I went to check on him. As I approached, I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. Matthew was asking Carl if they still needed that woman, meaning me, now that he was graduating and employed. Carl's response chilled me to the bone. He said I still had use value until the inheritance came through. Their casual cruelty as they discussed discarding me like trash made me feel physically ill. Matthew then mentioned inviting his birth mother to his graduation dinner. He casually mentioned that she'd attended his school events since elementary school. This revelation felt like a knife to my heart. I'd been denied attendance at every school event and told that parents didn't go to college graduations. Yet all along, his birth mother had been secretly included in these milestones. Carl chimed in, calling me a convenient housekeeper they'd lucked into after their divorce. Matthew complained about my cooking, revealing he'd been selling the lunches I'd lovingly prepared for him. Their laughter echoed in the kitchen as they mocked my efforts and devotion. I retreated silently to my room, my legs barely supporting me. As I crawled into bed, 20 years of memories flashed before my eyes. I'd raised Matthew since he was 2, yet I'd never been accepted as family. Tears streamed down my face as I made a decision I'd been considering for a long time. For 6 months, I pretended I hadn't heard their conversation, maintaining my usual demeanor. On the morning of Matthew's college graduation, he bustled about, preparing to leave. There was no word of thanks for raising him, no invitation to join them for a meal. Matthew's only words to me were that he wouldn't need dinner. If I hadn't overheard that conversation, it might not have bothered me, but now it stung. I knew they were probably going out to eat with Matthew's birth mother. Carl also said he wouldn't need a meal. As the house fell silent after they left, I sat alone with pen and paper. Just after 1 p.m., while I was having lunch out, my phone rang. It was Carl calling. I smirked and sipped my coffee, in no hurry to answer. I let it ring for a while, imagining Carl's panic on the other end. Finally, feeling a twinge of pity, I picked up the phone. "Hello," I said calmly. Carl's voice was frantic as he asked where I was and demanded an explanation for the note I'd left. I told him everything was in the note, and that telling him my location would defeat the purpose of running away. Carl stammered, unable to form coherent sentences. I sighed deeply and told him to file the divorce papers I'd left behind. This seemed to snap Carl back to reality. He declared he wouldn't accept the divorce and demanded to know why the tuition was unpaid. I couldn't help but smile at his priorities. I asked how he knew about the tuition if he was supposed to be at work. Carl faltered, realizing he'd revealed his presence at the graduation ceremony with Matthew's birth mother. He insisted I get my parents to pay the outstanding tuition immediately. I asked why a mere housekeeper should do such a thing, my voice sharp with long-suppressed anger. I confronted Carl about brainwashing Matthew not to get close to me from a young age. Carl denied it, claiming Matthew had called me Mom. I accused him of lying, saying it was only for appearances. I reminded Carl that I'd paid for 3.5 years of tuition, suggesting he pay the last semester as Matthew's father. With that, I hung up. Days after overhearing their late-night conversation, I'd received the tuition bill but couldn't bring myself to pay it. The university had contacted us several times, explaining that Matthew could attend the ceremony but wouldn't officially graduate without payment. They needed about $6,000 by the end of the day. After ending the call with Carl, Matthew called. Matthew's voice came through the phone, harsh and angry. He demanded to know why I hadn't paid his tuition, calling me a vile name that made my blood boil. I realized he wasn't with Carl, or he wouldn't dare speak to me like this. Keeping my voice steady, I told him to ask his father for details. I made it clear that I wanted nothing more to do with either of them. Matthew sputtered in confusion, but I cut him off mid-sentence and ended the call. Since overhearing their conversation, I'd resolved to leave them both behind. My phone rang incessantly that day, but I ignored it. The next day, I changed my number, severing that last connection. 3 months later, I discovered the divorce papers hadn't been filed. Irritated, I reluctantly returned to the house. The stench hit me as soon as I opened the door. The living room was a disaster zone of takeout containers and dirty laundry. In just 3 months, the house had devolved into a pigsty. Suddenly, I heard Carl call my name, sending a chill down my spine. I turned to see him, unshaven and disheveled. When I asked about his job, he admitted he'd been fired. Shocked, I pressed for details. Carl confessed he'd embezzled money to pay Matthew's tuition. I was stunned by his casual admission of such a serious crime. Carl tried to downplay it, insisting the company would forgive him if he repaid the money. He had the audacity to blame me for not paying the tuition, claiming he needed me back. To my disgust, he even declared his love for me, something he'd never done in our entire marriage. I looked at Carl, my voice laced with sarcasm as I suggested he try to solve his own problems for once. The filthy room and Carl's disheveled appearance were a perfect match. A cockroach scuttled out of an empty food container, and I couldn't help but laugh. I told Carl that if things continued like this, cockroaches would be his only family. Carl hung his head, unable to respond to my harsh words. After that, the divorce papers were finally filed. 3 years passed, and I had finally found happiness in a new life. Then I received news of my mother's passing. At the funeral, 2 familiar figures approached me. I looked up to see Carl and Matthew standing before me. Carl greeted me awkwardly, while Matthew commented on how well I looked. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope that they had come to pay their respects. However, Matthew quickly shattered that illusion by mentioning inheritance. I was disgusted by his blatant greed, especially at such a solemn occasion. When I pointed out that Matthew had no right to inherit anything, Carl chimed in, insisting that Matthew was still our child despite the divorce. Their audacity infuriated me, and I loudly told them to leave. Just then, 2 people approached, diffusing the tense situation. It was Robert and Sophia, my new husband and stepdaughter. Carl and Matthew visibly paled at their appearance. I introduced them as my ex-husband and his son. Carl stammered, addressing Robert as boss, which piqued my curiosity. I explained that Robert was my husband and Sophia was my daughter. Carl and Matthew's shocked expressions told me they hadn't expected this turn of events. Robert addressed Carl, reminding him of their work relationship. I was stunned to learn that Carl worked for Robert's company. Carl looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Robert warned Carl not to hurt me further, blurring the line between personal and professional. Sophia chimed in, telling Matthew he had no inheritance rights. Her familiarity with Matthew surprised me. Sophia revealed that she was my biological daughter, shocking Matthew. I explained that Robert was my first husband, and we had Sophia together. My in-laws had forced me to give up Sophia, telling me to forget I ever had a child. Despite the separation, Robert ensured Sophia grew up knowing about me. She even sent me caring letters once a year, thanks to Robert's influence. I told Carl and Matthew about reconnecting with Robert after my divorce. Robert had never remarried, still holding feelings for me after all these years. With his parents gone and his career stable, he proposed we marry again. Carl turned pale, realizing the woman he had treated as a mere housekeeper was deeply loved by others. Sophia then revealed that Matthew had asked her out, likely because of her connection to Robert. She firmly rejected him, citing his family's manipulative behavior towards me. Matthew hung his head in despair, quietly wiping away tears. I felt a twinge of sadness, thinking how different things could have been if Matthew hadn't been influenced by Carl's toxic attitudes. I couldn't help but nod in agreement, thinking aloud that Sophia would indeed have a tough time with someone like Matthew. I jokingly apologized for my poor parenting, suggesting that Sophia deserved someone much better. I advised Matthew to step away from both Sophia and any thoughts of inheritance. Matthew glared at me for a moment, but I knew he had no grounds to argue. While I acknowledged he was also a victim of Carl's influence, he was an adult now. I realized that unless he and his father recognized their faults, they'd never find true happiness. Robert then politely but firmly asked them to leave, reminding them this was a place for family. His words were a perfect echo of what I'd once been told, that I wasn't family. It felt like poetic justice to hear those words directed at Carl and Matthew. Later, I learned that Carl continued to work at Robert's company despite the awkwardness. When I asked Robert why he'd hired Carl, knowing our history, his answer warmed my heart. He explained that keeping Carl under his supervision was a way to protect me from any potential harassment. Robert also shared some surprising news about Matthew. Apparently, Matthew had moved out and was living on his own, possibly reflecting on his past behavior. While I felt a sense of epic heresy towards Carl, I found myself hoping Matthew would find his way to happiness. My concern for his future was perhaps a sign that I had truly been a mother to him, despite everything. I continued living with Robert and Sophia, finally experiencing the family life I'd always longed for. Robert shared that his parents had regretted their actions after seeing how miserable he and Sophia were without me. I admitted to Robert that I had experienced moments of happiness in my previous marriage. But I also expressed my belief that my greatest happiness was still to come. With Sophia's wedding on the horizon and a chance to create new, joyful memories, I looked forward to growing and healing, turning past struggles into stories we could laugh about together.